Aquila, Chapter 12. When Jeff emerged from Miss Stevenson's house, it was with a strange feeling of content. Partly, it was knowing that his 2-hour Saturday morning session with the special needs teacher was over, and that the rest of the weekend was his to do with as he liked. But it was something deeper as well. There was, when Jeff considered it, a lot to be content about. In the 3 weeks since the meeting with Miss Taylor, they had found somewhere safe to keep Aquila. They had flown it the length and breadth of the country, and that afternoon they were planning to take it on their first flight across the Atlantic. It was only going to be a test run, a quick trip to New York and home again, but Jeff was rather looking forward to it. He walked to the end of the road and turned left along the path that would lead him up to the old water tower. It had proved a very satisfactory hiding place. Built at the start of the century to provide water for the rows of terraced houses being constructed at the bottom of the hill, it was about 50 meters high, made of brick, and had been derelict for nearly 30 years. The door and windows at the bottom were boarded up and surrounded with barbed wire, but at the top the boys had found just what they wanted. They had been able to fly in, the windows had neither frames nor glass, to a room that was large, dry, out of sight from anyone on the ground, and totally inaccessible. There was, of course, the problem of how the boys were to get up and down themselves. If they left Aquila at the top of the tower, they would still need to be able to get down to go home, and they would need to be able to get back up again when they wanted to retrieve it. The solution had been surprisingly simple. Going through the lights on the dash, asking Aquila to explain what each of them was for, they had come across one described as the preset spatial coordinate register for automatic return. What it meant was that Aquila was able to fly on its own. It did not even matter if there was anyone inside. At the instructed speed and in perfect safety, it could fly to whatever destination it had been given. The Roman centurion had known about it. They had found several of his settings still in Aquila's memory, and it made Tom shudder to realize that if Jeff had pressed a different button that first day in the garage, they could have found themselves flying to a small town in central Bulgaria. They had given Aquila instructions that would make it fly to the top of the tower and back to the ground again on a prearranged signal. Aquila could recognize signals in several thousand languages and as many frequencies, but the boys had settled in the end on using a dog whistle. Pitched to a level beyond the human ear, they had decided it would attract less attention. The feeling of contentment stayed with Jeff as the path narrowed and he climbed through the wood. At the top, standing at the base of the tower, he blew 3 short blasts and 2 long on the whistle he took from his pocket. A moment later, he reached down to his right, felt Aquila's hull beside him, and climbed in. Aquila was programmed to arrive invisible to the right of whoever had blown the whistle, so it was wise to be careful where you were standing. The machine was very literal, and Tom had once blown the whistle while he was standing next to a tree. The stump was still there, and the trunk lay at the bottom of the hill, where it had fallen. The 2 parts had been cleanly separated in a way that still puzzled the man from the council who had been called out to investigate. Sitting in Aquila, Jeff asked, "Is Tom up there?" "Yes." The letters flashed up in front of him, and beside them was a small line drawing, like a cartoon of a boy sitting at a desk. "He's working. He is doing his homework." There was another drawing of Tom writing in an exercise book. Aquila often used pictures when answering Jeff's questions, and it always used the simplest, shortest words. He had explained to it very early on that his reading was limited and asked it to speak rather than writing words in the air. Aquila, unfortunately, could not oblige. It could communicate in most of the known languages of the galaxy, but its vocal generator had been destroyed by an Uralian photon blast 6,000 years before. The mechanism had been situated somewhere in the discolored, twisted fin at the back that the boys had noticed the first day they had found it. But if Aquila could not help Jeff by talking, it could and did make the words it used as easy as possible for him to read. And on one occasion, both the boys had found this useful. The week before, when they had been asking about the function of some of the lights, one was described as the chlorine atmospheric regenerator. When Tom had asked what would happen if they tried it, Aquila said, "Negative survival potential indicated for present life form," which meant very little to either of them. But when Jeff had asked the same question, it said, "No, no, ah!" and produced a little picture of a man coughing and spluttering until he keeled over and died. Chlorine, it turned out, is a very poisonous gas. In a way, it had been rather reassuring. Aquila could have flown back up to the top of the tower on a simple command, but Jeff preferred to do it himself. Taking the controls, he spiraled up the tower in a series of circles, stopped outside the window at the top, and carefully backed inside. The place looked rather homey these days. Over in the corner, Tom was sitting at a table listening to music from an aged radiogram while finishing off his maths homework. He looked up as Jeff turned off the invisibility. "Nearly finished," he pointed to a mug. "I got you a drink ready. It just needs heating up." As Jeff climbed out of Aquila, he couldn't help thinking how much his friend had changed in the last few weeks. If you had seen him last Sunday, leaning casually out of Aquila somewhere over the Pyrenees, determinedly banging away at a lump of basalt with a hammer, you would not have recognized him. There was a decisiveness in the way he moved and spoke these days, and if you saw him with Mr. Urquhart talking confidently about fossil finds or why there were different colors in limestone, it was hard to believe he was the same person. Collecting his mug, Jeff carefully placed it under the rear fin. Aquila could heat a mug of drinking chocolate with a controlled blast of microwaves in a fraction of a second. It was only one of many conveniences, Jeff thought, and he was suddenly caught again by that strange sense of contentment, a feeling of satisfaction that came from somewhere deep inside and that made him want to smile for no real reason at all. He looked around the room. Most of the furniture had come from Mrs. Murphy, and it was good to know the old lady was a lot happier these days. She had decided not to take any more pills and found she was no longer seeing or hearing things. She and Mrs. Baxter had taken to going to the cinema together a couple of afternoons a week, and on Friday evenings the boys did her weekly shopping at Tesco's. It was in return for this that she had offered them anything they wanted from the odd bits of old furniture she had stored in her garage and attic. They had taken an elderly sofa, a carpet, a kitchen table and chairs, a table lamp, a black and white television, and the radiogram. There was no electricity in the tower, of course, but Aquila could power anything electrical up to a range of 200 meters. It could also blanket any sound or light in the room so that nobody outside could hear or see what was going on. Aquila could do so many things. Tom had once asked it to list them all, but abandoned the idea when it turned out the list would take 3.5 days to read. On the wall along from the table was a set of shelves holding the rocks and fossils that Tom had collected over the last few weeks. There were bits of colored sandstone from the Isle of Wight, chunks of hexagonal basalt from Staffa in Scotland, and on the bottom shelf, pride of the collection, the pointed piece of granite that had once been the top of the Matterhorn. Aquila's laser had sliced it off like a knob of butter. And one day, thought Jeff, someone was going to notice that the highest mountain in the Alps was only 4,477.2 meters high instead of 4,477.5. The wall above the sofa was where Jeff kept his trophies. There was the photo of him standing beside the statue at the top of Nelson's column. There was the hat that he had snatched from President Clinton on his state visit to London. There were the bales from the last test match played against Pakistan, and a couple of fading chrysanthemums that he had picked from the gardens at Buckingham Palace. All finished. Tom put down his pen and stood up. Normally he liked to check his homework with Aquila, but he could do that later. He came over and stood by his friend. "How was the lesson?" Jeff shrugged. "It was okay." Jeff would never admit it, but in fact, his lessons with Miss Stevenson were a lot more than okay. She worked with an efficiency that had won his respect, and a sense of humor he had come to appreciate. Above all, she was a woman who knew how to do her job, and for the first time in his life, Jeff had begun to find the world of words and letters beginning to make some sort of sense. It had been a revelation. He had started reading road signs, odd words from the television, and the belief was beginning to grow that one day he would... "This trip this afternoon," Tom interrupted his thoughts. "I've got everything packed, but would you mind if we did America tomorrow?" "Tomorrow?" "It's Mom," Tom explained. "She's arranged to visit these cousins in Stockport, and she wants me to go with her." Mrs. Baxter had been arranging a good many trips since she had taken delivery of her car. Most days she visited some branch of the family or an old friend, and all this on top of the cinema trips with Mrs. Murphy and the evening classes in Japanese swordsmanship. It was as if she was trying to make up for 3 years of staying at home by doing 3 times as much as everyone else. Tom looked at his watch. I think we'd have to allow at least 2 hours for New York to be on the safe side, and I said I'd be home by 1:30. Of course, if you want to go on your own. No, tomorrow will be fine. Still holding his mug of chocolate, Jeff climbed into Aquila. We'll just go somewhere else, somewhere closer. Again, he felt that curious upsurge of happiness. It bubbled up in his mind, but annoyingly, he still couldn't put his finger on where it came from. Tom picked up the bag with the packed lunches and swung himself into Aquila beside Jeff. Neither of them bothered with coats these days. Wherever they flew, Aquila could keep the temperature at any level you asked. I'll take her up, shall I? He said, till you've finished your drink. As Tom took the controls, Aquila floated gently out of the tower into the sunshine. From beneath them came the buzz of traffic from the town, the sound of the breeze ruffling through the trees, and the noise of children playing over in the park. Where do you want to go then? For a moment, Jeff did not reply. He suddenly had the feeling that he had turned on an important corner. It was as if he had been climbing a particularly perilous steep stretch in an upward path, and now found himself on broad open ground again, with the road stretching invitingly ahead. He felt he had understood something for the first time, only he couldn't quite think what it was. It's your turn to choose, isn't it? Tom waited patiently, but Jeff still did not reply. He was concentrating hard. If he concentrated, he knew he would find the answer that floated tantalizingly out of reach, somewhere in the top of his mind. There's lots of things we could do. Tom stared up at the sky. We could fly over to the national park if you wanted, see this axe thing Dr. Warner's so excited about. He nearly had it, Jeff thought. It was almost in his grasp. Or we could go to Paris again, Tom continued. Find out if your chewing gum's still stuck on the top of the Eiffel Tower. He paused. We can do anything, really. That's it. A slow smile spread across Jeff's face. That's it, isn't it? What? That's the whole point. We can go wherever we want. Yes, said Tom. Frankly, it seemed a bit obvious, but he decided not to say anything. For some reason, Jeff seemed to think it was important. You find yourself an eagle, and you can go where you like, anywhere. Jeff seemed entranced by the concept. Anywhere at all. Right. Tom nodded. There was a long pause until Tom eventually asked, So, where do you want to go then? I'm not sure. Jeff sipped his mug of chocolate. But I think, first, I'd like to go up. Up? Up high. Jeff nodded. I want to see the view. Tom shrugged. Okay. Aquila started to rise, higher and higher, gathering speed as it went until the noises faded, and first the people, and then the cars, and even the buildings ceased to be separate entities, and all of Staveley became just an irregular circle in the surrounding green of the countryside, and the noise faded to a deep silence. And still they climbed, up and up, soaring into the sky until, even if Aquila had not been invisible from the ground, it would have been too small to see. It was a perfect day, and Tom could see wisps of cloud floating far below, casting tiny shadows on the ground beneath. Is this high enough? He asked. I would say, Jeff turned and smiled at his friend, I would say that we've hardly started. The end.